The fluorescent lights of Walgreens buzzed overhead as I clutched the prescription bottle containing my chemotherapy pills, watching Derek's BMW disappear into the December darkness. "Maybe dealing with this alone will teach you some independence," he'd said, not even bothering to look at me as I stepped out into the freezing Chicago wind. He had no idea that in exactly 47 minutes, at the stroke of midnight on my 35th birthday, I would inherit $800 million from a trust fund I'd forgotten existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to that moment outside the pharmacy, because what Derek thought was my lowest point was actually the precise moment my real life began. It was December 22nd, 2023, and the irony wasn't lost on me that I was spending the evening before my birthday picking up medication that might save my life while my husband of 8 years had just abandoned me in a strip mall parking lot. The cancer diagnosis had come 3 weeks earlier during what was supposed to be a routine checkup. Dr. Patricia Williams had called me back into her office after reviewing my test results, her expression carefully neutral in that way doctors practice when delivering devastating news. "Sarah, I need to discuss your biopsy results," she'd said, gesturing for me to sit down. "We found malignant cells." The words had hit me like a physical blow. At 34, cancer felt like something that happened to other people, older people who had lived full lives already. I was supposed to be in my prime, building a career, maybe starting a family with Derek. Instead, I was suddenly facing a battle I'd never prepared for and wasn't sure I could win. Derek's reaction to my diagnosis had been telling in ways I hadn't fully understood at the time. While I'd expected fear, concern, or even sadness, what I got was frustration. "This is really going to complicate things," he'd said after I told him the news. Not, "We'll get through this together," or, "What do you need from me," but concern about how my illness would inconvenience his life. The treatment plan Dr. Williams outlined was aggressive but hopeful. Early-stage breast cancer, caught before it had spread, with an 85% 5-year survival rate with proper treatment. The chemotherapy would be challenging, she explained, but the prognosis was good if I followed the protocol exactly. The pills I now held in my trembling hands were the first line of defense in what would be a 6-month battle for my life. Standing in that parking lot, I realized that Derek's abandonment wasn't actually about the pharmacy errand. It was about his fundamental inability to handle anything that required him to be genuinely supportive rather than just casually present. For 8 years, I'd been so focused on being the perfect wife that I'd never noticed how little he actually contributed to our partnership beyond showing up and looking good at social events. Our marriage had been built on a foundation of convenience rather than genuine connection. Derek worked in finance, making decent money but nothing spectacular. I worked as a freelance graphic designer, contributing significantly to our household income while also managing all the domestic responsibilities that Derek considered beneath his attention. The division of labor in our relationship had always been skewed, but facing cancer had made the imbalance impossible to ignore. The weeks following my diagnosis had revealed the true nature of Derek's character. When I needed rides to medical appointments, he complained about the inconvenience to his work schedule. When I asked him to research treatment options with me, he claimed he didn't understand medical terminology and suggested I handle it myself. When I tried to discuss my fears about the treatment and prognosis, he changed the subject to something more comfortable for him to process. Most damning had been his reaction when I'd asked him to come with me to pick up my first round of chemotherapy medication. "It's just a pharmacy run, Sarah," he'd said dismissively. "You're perfectly capable of handling that yourself. Besides, I have an important client dinner tonight." The client dinner had turned out to be drinks with his college friends, but by then I'd already learned not to challenge his priorities. The prescription pickup had become symbolic of everything wrong with our relationship. These weren't just pills, they were potentially life-saving medication that represented the beginning of the most challenging period of my life. Having Derek refuse to accompany me felt like a preview of how alone I would be during the months of treatment ahead. But as I stood outside that Walgreens, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the cancer diagnosis forcing me to confront my own mortality, or maybe it was Derek's casual cruelty finally breaking through years of accumulated resentment. Either way, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. I was done accepting treatment that diminished my worth as a human being. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me. In less than an hour, I would turn 35, which meant I would finally gain access to the Whitmore Family Trust Fund that my grandmother had established before her death 20 years earlier. Helena Whitmore had been a remarkable woman who'd built a textile empire in the 1950s when few women were running major businesses. She'd always believed that financial independence was the foundation of personal freedom, especially for women. The trust fund had been set up with very specific conditions. I couldn't access the money until I turned 35, and only if I was still unmarried or could prove that my marriage was built on genuine partnership rather than financial dependence. My grandmother had been ahead of her time in understanding how financial inequality could trap women in unsatisfying relationships. For years, I'd forgotten about the trust fund entirely. Derek and I had built our life together assuming we were both middle-class professionals who would need to work for decades to achieve real financial security. The trust fund felt like a fairy tale from my childhood, something my grandmother had mentioned, but that didn't seem relevant to my adult reality. But standing in that parking lot, abandoned by my husband while holding cancer medication, I remembered my grandmother's words about the trust fund's true purpose. "This money isn't about luxury, Sarah," she told me when I was 15. "It's about choice. It's about never having to stay somewhere you're not valued simply because you can't afford to leave." The thought of $800 million felt surreal, almost impossible to process. That kind of money would change everything about my life in ways I could barely comprehend. But more than the financial freedom, it represented validation of my grandmother's belief that I deserved better than what I was currently accepting. Derek had no idea about the trust fund. I'd mentioned it years ago when we were first dating, but he dismissed it as one of those family stories that gets exaggerated over time. "Rich relatives always claim they're leaving money to people," he'd said with a laugh. "Usually it turns out to be a few $1,000s and some antique furniture." I'd never corrected his assumption because it hadn't seemed important at the time. Now, as I stood alone outside the pharmacy, I realized that Derek's ignorance about my inheritance was actually a gift. It meant that every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every moment of neglect had been genuine rather than calculated. He'd shown me exactly who he was when he thought I had no power to change my situation. The December wind was biting through my coat, but I felt warmer than I had in months. Not because of any external comfort, but because I was finally seeing my situation clearly. Derek hadn't just abandoned me at a pharmacy, he'd shown me that he was fundamentally incapable of being the partner I needed during the most challenging period of my life. My phone buzzed with a text message from my lawyer, Victoria Chen, whom my grandmother had retained specifically to handle the trust fund transition. "Sarah, I'll be calling you at midnight to confirm the fund activation. Are you prepared for tomorrow's meeting?" The message was a reminder that my life was about to change in ways Derek couldn't imagine. Victoria had been managing the trust fund's investments for 2 decades, growing my grandmother's initial bequest from $400 million to over $800 million through careful portfolio management and strategic investments. She'd been waiting for this moment almost as long as I had, preparing for the day when I would finally have access to resources that could transform not just my life but the lives of everyone around me. The trust fund came with certain responsibilities and opportunities that Victoria had been explaining to me over the past few months as my 35th birthday approached. There were charitable obligations, investment decisions to make, and business opportunities to consider. But the most important aspect was the freedom it would provide to make choices based on what I actually wanted rather than what I could afford. Standing outside that pharmacy, I began to understand what my grandmother had really given me. It wasn't just money, it was the power to control my own destiny. The power to leave situations that didn't serve me, to pursue opportunities that excited me, and to surround myself with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could do for them. Derek's BMW was long gone, disappeared into the Chicago traffic like a bad memory I was finally ready to release. He thought he was teaching me a lesson about independence, but what he'd actually done was give me the perfect moment to begin my real life. The life where I didn't have to accept cruelty disguised as education, where my needs mattered as much as anyone else's, where being sick didn't make me a burden to be managed rather than a person to be supported. The prescription bottle felt lighter in my hands as I walked toward the bus stop. Not because the medication had changed, but because I had. In 43 minutes, I would inherit enough money to buy Derek's company several times over. But more importantly, I would inherit the freedom to build a life where people like Derek simply didn't matter anymore. The bus that pulled up was nearly empty, just a few late-night workers heading home and a woman about my age reading a book under the fluorescent lighting. As I settled into a seat, I caught my reflection in the window and smiled for the first time in weeks. The woman looking back at me wasn't a victim of Derek's cruelty or a patient defined by her illness. She was someone who was about to discover exactly what she was capable of when she had the resources to match her ambitions. My phone showed 11:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, everything would change. But the change had already begun the moment Derek drove away, leaving me standing in that parking lot with my cancer medication and my newly awakened sense of self-worth. He'd intended to diminish me, but instead he'd freed me from the last remaining illusion that our marriage was worth preserving. The bus moved through the December night toward my apartment, toward midnight, toward a future that Derek could never have imagined and would never be able to touch. As the city lights blurred past the window, I began planning not just my escape from a marriage that had never truly valued me, but my transformation into someone who would never again accept less than she deserved. The cancer diagnosis had forced me to confront my mortality, but Derek's abandonment had forced me to confront something even more important, my own worth. And in less than 10 minutes, I would have 800 million reasons to ensure that worth was never questioned again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the bus pulled up to my stop, I realized that Derek had been right about one thing. Tonight was going to teach me about independence. Just not in the way he'd intended. The call came at exactly midnight, just as Victoria had promised. I was sitting in my small apartment kitchen, still wearing the coat I'd worn to the pharmacy, watching the clock on my phone tick over to December 23rd. My 35th birthday had officially begun, and with it, everything I thought I knew about my life was about to change. Happy birthday, Sarah. Victoria's voice carried a warmth that I'd rarely heard from lawyers. Are you ready to discuss your inheritance? The word inheritance felt surreal. For the past 8 years, I'd lived paycheck to paycheck with Derek, carefully budgeting our grocery money and splitting restaurant bills. The idea that I was suddenly worth $800 million seemed like something that happened to other people in movies or tabloid stories, not to graphic designers sitting in cramped Chicago apartments at midnight. I'm not sure anyone can be ready for this, I replied honestly, looking around my tiny kitchen with its chipped countertops and outdated appliances. It doesn't feel real yet. Victoria's laugh was understanding. Your grandmother said the same thing when she first inherited her father's textile business. Helena Whitmore never expected to become one of the wealthiest women in America, but she learned that money is simply a tool. What matters is how you choose to use it. Over the next hour, Victoria walked me through the details of my inheritance. With the patience of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for 20 years. The trust fund had been meticulously managed, with investments in everything from blue-chip stocks to emerging technology companies to real estate holdings across 3 continents. My grandmother's initial $400 million had grown to $837 million, with additional assets including properties, art collections, and business holdings that brought the total value to over $1 billion. The trust was designed to activate on your 35th birthday for very specific reasons, Victoria explained. Your grandmother believed that women needed time to understand themselves and their relationships before gaining access to this level of financial power. She wanted to ensure you had enough life experience to use the money wisely rather than having it use you. The conditions of the trust were exactly as I'd remembered from my grandmother's explanations years earlier. The money was mine unconditionally, but there were strong recommendations about how it should be used. Education, both for myself and others. Charitable giving, particularly focused on women's economic empowerment. Business investments that created positive social impact. And perhaps most importantly, the freedom to make choices based on what would fulfill me rather than what I could afford. There's something else you need to know, Victoria continued, her tone becoming more serious. Your grandmother included specific provisions in the trust regarding marriages that might be motivated by financial considerations rather than genuine partnership. If you choose to divorce Derek, the prenuptial agreement you signed becomes void because it was signed under conditions of financial inequality. I had completely forgotten about the prenuptial agreement Derek had insisted on before our wedding. At the time, he presented it as a practical formality, claiming it would protect both of us in the unlikely event our marriage didn't work out. I'd signed it without much thought because I had no significant assets to protect and trusted that our relationship was built on love rather than financial considerations. What does that mean practically? I asked, though I was beginning to understand the implications. It means that Derek has no claim to any portion of your inheritance, but it also means you're under no obligation to share marital assets acquired during your marriage if you choose to end the relationship. Your grandmother was very thorough in protecting your interests, even in scenarios she hoped would never occur. The conversation with Victoria lasted until nearly 2 in the morning, covering everything from tax implications to investment strategies, to the logistics of managing such significant wealth. By the time we hung up, I had a clear understanding of my new financial reality and a meeting scheduled for later that morning to begin the formal transfer process. Sitting alone in my apartment after Victoria's call, I felt the weight of my new reality settling over me like a heavy blanket. $800 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, disconnected from the life I'd been living just hours earlier. But gradually, as the shock began to wear off, I started to understand what this inheritance really meant in practical terms. I could pay for the best possible cancer treatment without worrying about insurance coverage or co-payments. I could hire the most experienced oncologists, access experimental treatments, and focus entirely on healing rather than managing the financial stress that often accompanies serious illness. The relief of knowing that my medical care would never be limited by financial constraints felt almost as significant as the inheritance itself. More than that, I could leave Derek immediately without any concern about how I would support myself during treatment or beyond. The apartment we shared, the car payments, the shared credit cards, all the financial entanglements that often keep people trapped in unsatisfying relationships were suddenly irrelevant. I had the freedom to make decisions based purely on what was best for my health and happiness. The next morning, Derek returned home from wherever he'd spent the night with the casual indifference that had become characteristic of his approach to our marriage. He walked into the kitchen where I was sitting with my laptop, researching oncology specialists and treatment centers, and poured himself coffee without acknowledging my presence. "How was your pharmacy adventure?" he asked with barely concealed sarcasm. "Did you manage to handle the complicated task of picking up pills?" I looked up from my research, studying Derek's face as if seeing him clearly for the first time. His expression carried that familiar mixture of condescension and casual cruelty that I'd learned to accept as normal over the years of our marriage. But this morning, after spending the night learning about my inheritance and my options, his behavior felt different. Not more hurtful, but more obviously unacceptable. "The pharmacy went fine," I replied calmly. "But I think we need to talk about our marriage." Derek's expression shifted slightly, probably picking up on something different in my tone. For 8 years, I'd approached our conflicts with apologies and attempts at compromise. I'd accepted his criticism as feedback I needed to consider, his neglect as busy schedule demands I needed to understand. This morning, I felt no inclination to soften my words or manage his emotional reactions. "What's there to talk about?" Derek asked, settling into the chair across from me with his coffee. "You're dealing with cancer, which is stressful, but that doesn't mean we need to make everything more dramatic than it has to be." The dismissiveness in his voice confirmed everything I'd realized during the long night of conversation with Victoria. Derek wasn't capable of taking my concerns seriously because he'd never had to take me seriously. In his mind, I was financially dependent on him, which meant my opinions were ultimately irrelevant to any major decisions about our relationship. "I'm talking about the fact that you abandoned me at a pharmacy while I was picking up chemotherapy medication," I said, keeping my voice steady and factual. "I'm talking about the fact that you've shown no interest in understanding my treatment or supporting me through what might be the most challenging period of my life." Derek's response was predictably defensive. "You're being overly dramatic. It was one evening, and you handled it fine. You don't need me hovering over you every time you leave the house. I thought you valued your independence." The word independence hung in the air between us, loaded with irony he couldn't possibly understand. Derek had always used my supposed need for independence as justification for his lack of involvement in anything that required emotional labor or genuine support. But what he called independence was actually neglect, and what he called hovering was actually the basic care that partners provide for each other during difficult times. "Derek," I said finally, "I want a divorce." The words came out more easily than I'd expected, clear and definitive without any of the apologetic hedging that had characterized most of our difficult conversations. I'd spent years softening my requests and cushioning my complaints to make them more palatable for Derek to hear. This morning, I felt no obligation to protect him from the reality of what our marriage had become. Derek's reaction was immediate and revealing. Not sadness or surprise or even anger about the end of our relationship, but annoyance about the inconvenience my decision would create for his life. "This is exactly what I mean about being dramatic," he said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd learned to hate. "You're dealing with a medical situation, and instead of focusing on getting better, you're creating relationship problems that don't need to exist." The fact that Derek could characterize 8 years of accumulated neglect and emotional distance as problems I was creating rather than problems we both shared told me everything I needed to know about his capacity for self-reflection or genuine partnership. "The relationship problems have existed for years," I replied. "The cancer diagnosis just made them impossible to ignore anymore." Derek spent the next 20 minutes alternating between minimizing my concerns and blaming me for creating unnecessary conflict during a stressful time. He suggested couples therapy, which felt particularly ironic given that he'd refused to accompany me to any of my medical appointments. He proposed that we wait until after my treatment to make major decisions, apparently not understanding that his lack of support during treatment was exactly why I needed to make this decision immediately. Throughout Derek's attempts to convince me I was being unreasonable, I found myself observing his behavior with a detachment I'd never felt before. The inheritance had given me more than financial freedom, it had given me the psychological space to see our relationship objectively rather than through the lens of financial dependence and limited options. "I've already contacted a lawyer," I told Derek when his arguments finally wound down. "I'll be moving out this week." This was when Derek's demeanor shifted from dismissive to concerned, though not for the reasons I might have hoped. His worry wasn't about losing me as a partner but about losing the financial contributions I'd been making to our shared expenses and the domestic labor I'd been providing without acknowledgement or reciprocation. "Where are you going to go?" Derek asked, and I could hear him calculating the logistics of my departure. "And how are you going to afford rent and medical bills on your freelance income?" The question revealed the fundamental assumption that had underpinned our entire marriage, that I needed Derek more than he needed me, that my options were limited by financial constraints he didn't share. Derek had never considered that I might have resources or opportunities he didn't know about because he'd never shown genuine curiosity about my life beyond how it affected his comfort and convenience. "I'll be fine," I replied, which was perhaps the greatest understatement I'd ever made. "I have more options than you realize." Derek's confusion was genuine, and I realized that he'd been so focused on maintaining his position of relative power in our relationship that he'd never bothered to understand my actual capabilities or potential. To him, I was Sarah the freelance graphic designer who needed his financial stability and social connections to maintain a middle-class lifestyle. He had no idea that Sarah the billionaire heiress had been sitting across from him at breakfast every morning for 8 years. The divorce conversation continued for another hour, with Derek cycling through various strategies to convince me to reconsider my decision. He promised to be more supportive during my treatment, though he couldn't specify what that support would look like. He suggested that cancer was affecting my judgment and that I should wait until I was feeling more like myself to make major life decisions. He even implied that leaving him during a health crisis showed poor judgment and questionable character. None of his arguments affected my decision because they were all based on the assumption that I had no better options available. Derek was trying to convince me to stay in a relationship that served his needs while consistently failing to meet mine, and his primary argument was that I couldn't do better on my own. What he didn't understand was that I no longer needed to do better on my own because I now had resources that made his contributions to my life completely unnecessary. "I'm not changing my mind," I told Derek finally. "The marriage is over." Derek's response revealed everything I needed to know about how he'd viewed our relationship. Instead of expressing sadness about losing our partnership or regret about his behavior, he immediately began calculating how my departure would affect his financial situation and social standing. "This is going to be expensive," he said, apparently forgetting that I was the one leaving and therefore the one who would need to establish a new living situation. "And what am I supposed to tell people about why you left?" The fact that Derek's primary concerns were financial convenience and social appearances rather than the loss of our relationship confirmed that I was making the right decision. He'd revealed that he saw our marriage as a practical arrangement that benefited him rather than an emotional partnership that fulfilled both of us. Over the next few days, I began the process of disentangling my life from Derek's with an efficiency that surprised both of us. The inheritance had given me resources that made every aspect of the separation simpler and faster than either of us had anticipated. My first call was to Dr. Patricia Williams to discuss transitioning my cancer treatment to a more specialized facility. With unlimited financial resources, I could access the most advanced treatment options available, including experimental therapies and personalized medicine approaches that might not be covered by standard insurance plans. "Sarah, there are several excellent options for patients in your situation," Dr. Williams explained during our phone consultation. "The Mayo Clinic has a comprehensive cancer center with cutting-edge research programs. Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York is considered the gold standard for breast cancer treatment. And if you're interested in alternative approaches, there are integrative medicine centers that combine traditional treatments with holistic support. The freedom to choose my treatment based on quality rather than cost felt revolutionary. For the first time since my diagnosis, I could focus entirely on healing rather than managing insurance approvals, copayments, and network restrictions. I scheduled consultations with oncologists at 3 different facilities, planning to make my treatment decisions based on medical expertise rather than financial limitations. Victoria had recommended a real estate agent who specialized in high-end properties, and within 2 days I was touring luxury apartments in Chicago's most desirable neighborhoods. The contrast between my current cramped space and the spacious, elegant homes I was now considering felt surreal, but also liberating. This unit has floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, explained Jennifer Morrison, the real estate agent, as we walked through a stunning penthouse apartment. The building has a full-service spa, fitness center, and concierge services. Many of our residents appreciate the privacy and security features. The apartment was larger than some houses, with a gourmet kitchen, 3 bedrooms, and amenities. That would make my cancer treatment as comfortable as possible. The monthly rent was more than Derek and I had spent on all our combined expenses, but it represented a tiny fraction of my new income. "I'll take it," I told Jennifer, enjoying the simplicity of making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. Derek's reaction to my rapid departure preparations revealed how little he'd understood about my capabilities. Or resources. He seemed genuinely shocked that I could afford to move into a luxury building, hire professional movers, and establish myself independently within a matter of days. "How are you paying for all this?" he asked as professional movers packed my belongings with careful efficiency. "And why didn't you ever mention having access to this kind of money?" The question was fair, but it also demonstrated the fundamental lack of curiosity Derek had shown about my life and background throughout our marriage. I had mentioned my grandmother's business success and the trust fund during our early dating years, but Derek had dismissed these stories as family mythology rather than investigating whether they might be true. "I inherited money from my grandmother," I explained simply. "The trust fund became available on my 35th birthday." Derek's expression shifted through several emotions as he processed this information. Surprise that I had access to significant wealth. Confusion about why I'd never mentioned it more specifically. And then, predictably, anger that I was using this financial independence to leave him rather than to improve our shared lifestyle. "You've had access to millions of dollars and you're choosing to use it to break up our marriage instead of making our lives better?" Derek asked, his voice rising with indignation. The question revealed everything about how Derek understood relationships and money. In his mind, my inheritance should have been deployed to benefit both of us equally, regardless of how he'd treated me or whether our marriage was actually fulfilling for me. He seemed to believe that financial resources created an obligation to maintain relationships, even relationships that had become emotionally damaging. "Derek," I said carefully, "the money doesn't change the fundamental problems in our marriage. It just gives me the freedom to address them honestly." Derek spent the remainder of that week trying various strategies to convince me to reconsider the divorce. He suggested that we could use my inheritance to travel, buy a house, start a family, or pursue other shared goals that might strengthen our relationship. He promised to be more attentive and supportive during my cancer treatment. He even proposed couples therapy with the most expensive marriage counselors in Chicago. All of his suggestions were based on the assumption that our marriage problems stemmed from external stresses rather than fundamental incompatibilities. Derek seemed to believe that enough money and professional intervention could fix a relationship built on unequal power dynamics and mutual indifference. He couldn't understand that I wasn't leaving because our life together was financially difficult, but because it was emotionally unsatisfying. The most revealing conversation came when Derek explicitly asked me to reconsider the divorce in exchange for his promise to change his behavior. "I know I haven't been as supportive as I should have been," he admitted during what would be our final serious conversation about our marriage. "But finding out about your diagnosis was scary for me too. I didn't know how to handle it, so I probably seemed more distant than I intended." Derek's explanation contained a kernel of genuine self-reflection, but it was wrapped in justifications and excuses that demonstrated he still didn't understand the scope of the problems in our relationship. His lack of support during my cancer diagnosis hadn't been an isolated mistake but rather the culmination of years of emotional neglect and casual cruelty. "Derek, this isn't just about the cancer," I replied. "This is about 8 years of feeling like my needs and opinions don't matter to you. The cancer just made it impossible to ignore anymore." Derek's response was to minimize my concerns and redirect the conversation toward more practical considerations. "But we've built a life together," he said. "We have shared friends, shared responsibilities, shared plans for the future. Throwing all of that away because of some relationship issues that we could work on seems short-sighted." The phrase, "some relationship issues," perfectly captured Derek's inability to take my concerns seriously. In his mind, 8 years of accumulated resentment and emotional distance were minor problems that could be solved with good intentions and professional help. He couldn't see that our shared life had been built on a foundation of inequality that my inheritance had finally given me the power to escape. "The life we built together was never really ours," I told Derek finally. "It was your life, with me filling in the gaps where you needed support or companionship. I've never been an equal partner in this marriage, and I don't think you're capable of seeing me as one." Derek's final argument was perhaps the most telling of all. Instead of expressing sadness about losing our relationship or regret about his behavior, he focused on the practical inconveniences my departure would create for his lifestyle. "This is going to be really disruptive," he said. "I'll have to find a new place to live, figure out all the household management stuff you've been handling, rebuild my social life around being single again. And all of this during the holidays when everything is more complicated." Derek's primary concern was that ending our marriage would require him to take responsibility for aspects of his life that I'd been managing without acknowledgement or appreciation. He wasn't mourning the loss of our partnership, he was annoyed about losing the domestic support I'd been providing while receiving little in return. By the end of that week, I had moved into my new apartment, established care with a new oncology team, and begun the legal process of divorce with representation that Derek couldn't possibly match. The inheritance had given me more than financial freedom, it had given me the clarity to see our relationship objectively and the power to make changes based on what I actually wanted rather than what I thought I could afford. Derek's reaction to my rapid transformation from dependent wife to independent woman revealed everything about his character and our marriage. He wasn't devastated by losing me, he was frustrated by losing the convenience I'd provided. He wasn't fighting to save our relationship, he was negotiating to minimize the disruption to his lifestyle. Standing in my new apartment on New Year's Eve, exactly 1 week after my inheritance had been activated, I realized that Derek had been wrong about almost everything. He'd thought abandoning me at the pharmacy would teach me about dependence and gratitude. Instead, it had taught me about self-worth and the power of financial independence to transform not just circumstances but entire identities. The woman who had stood outside that Walgreens clutching cancer medication and watching her husband drive away was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that true independence meant having the resources to make choices based on what would fulfill her rather than what she could afford to risk losing. The first time I walked into Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in Manhattan, I understood what $800 million could actually buy beyond luxury apartments and expensive cars. It could buy hope in its most tangible form, delivered by the world's most experienced oncologists using treatment protocols that weren't available to patients with standard insurance coverage. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the head of their experimental therapy division, reviewed my case files with the kind of thorough attention I'd never experienced in Chicago's overwhelmed medical system. Her office overlooked Central Park, and the entire consultation felt more like a strategic business meeting than a medical appointment. "Sarah, your cancer was caught early, which gives us excellent treatment options," Dr. Rodriguez explained, spreading my test results across her mahogany desk. "But given your financial resources, we can also consider some cutting-edge approaches that might not just treat your cancer but potentially prevent any recurrence." The treatment plan she outlined was revolutionary. Instead of standard chemotherapy, I could access personalized medicine protocols that analyzed my specific cancer genetics and designed treatments targeted to my individual cellular makeup. Instead of hoping for the best with one-size-fits-all approaches, I could receive therapy designed specifically for my biology. The personalized treatment protocol costs approximately $200,000 over 6 months, Dr. Rodriguez continued. "Most insurance companies consider it experimental, but our success rates are significantly higher than traditional chemotherapy, with fewer side effects and better long-term outcomes. $200,000 for potentially life-saving treatment that might preserve my quality of life during recovery. 6 months earlier, that amount would have been impossible to consider. Now, it represented less than 1 day's interest on my investment portfolio. When can we start?" I asked, and Dr. Rodriguez smiled with the satisfaction of a physician who could finally provide optimal care without financial constraints. The next few weeks became a whirlwind of medical consultations, treatment planning, and lifestyle adjustments that would have been unimaginable during my marriage to Derek. Instead of managing cancer treatment around work schedules and insurance limitations, I could focus entirely on healing while accessing every resource that might improve my outcomes. Victoria had introduced me to a wealth management team that specialized in handling sudden inheritance situations. The transition from middle-class graphic designer to billionaire heiress required professional guidance to navigate tax implications, investment strategies, and the psychological adjustments that came with such dramatic financial change. "Sudden wealth can be overwhelming," explained Dr. Michael Chen, the financial psychologist Victoria had recommended. "Many people who inherit large amounts struggle with guilt, anxiety, and relationship changes. It's important to develop a healthy framework for understanding your new circumstances." Dr. Chen helped me recognize that the disorientation I was feeling wasn't unusual. Going from budgeting grocery money to having unlimited financial resources created a kind of cognitive dissonance that required time and support to process. The inheritance hadn't just changed my bank account, it had fundamentally altered my relationship with choice, security, and possibility. Your grandmother designed the trust fund to activate at 35 because she understood that financial power requires emotional maturity to handle responsibly, Dr. Chen explained during one of our sessions. She wanted you to understand yourself and your values before gaining access to resources that could change everything about your life. The wisdom of my grandmother's timing became more apparent as I navigated the early weeks of my new reality. At 25, I might have used the money impulsively or allowed it to distort my sense of identity. At 35, facing cancer and the end of my marriage, I had enough life experience to understand that money was a tool for creating the life I actually wanted rather than an end in itself. My treatment at Memorial Sloan Kettering began in February, and the difference from standard cancer care was immediately apparent. Instead of crowded waiting rooms and rushed appointments, I received personalized attention from a team of specialists who had time to explain every aspect of my treatment and answer questions in detail. The personalized therapy protocols meant that my side effects were minimal compared to traditional chemotherapy. Instead of the debilitating nausea and fatigue I'd been preparing for, I experienced mild tiredness and occasional digestive sensitivity that could be managed with adjustments to medication timing and dosing. Your response to treatment is exceptional, Dr. Rodriguez told me during my 6-week follow-up appointment. The tumor markers are decreasing faster than we typically see, and your overall health indicators are actually improving throughout treatment. The medical success was gratifying, but the psychological transformation was even more profound. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based purely on what would be best for my health and happiness, without considering financial limitations or other people's expectations. During my treatment weeks in New York, I lived in a furnished apartment near the hospital that cost more per month than Derek and I had spent on our mortgage. The space was designed for comfort and healing, with a chef who prepared meals according to my treatment dietary requirements and a housekeeper who ensured my environment remained spotless to protect my immune system during therapy. The contrast with how Derek had expected me to manage cancer treatment was stark. He'd assumed I would continue handling all my normal responsibilities while fitting medical appointments around his schedule and our budget constraints. Instead, I was able to focus entirely on healing while professionals managed every aspect of my daily needs. The divorce proceedings with Derek revealed his true character in ways that our marriage had only hinted at. When he realized the scale of my inheritance, his approach shifted from dismissive indifference to aggressive pursuit of what he considered his rightful share of my newfound wealth. Derek hired an expensive lawyer and attempted to challenge the prenuptial agreement we'd signed, claiming that I'd misrepresented my financial circumstances when we married. His argument was that the trust fund constituted marital property because it had existed during our marriage, even though I'd had no access to it until after I'd filed for divorce. Mr. Richardson's claims have no legal merit, my attorney, Rebecca Walsh, explained during one of our strategy meetings. The trust fund was specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of financial predation. Your grandmother included provisions that protect inheritance from claims by spouses who married you before you had access to the funds. Derek's legal challenge revealed how little he'd understood about my family history or the careful planning my grandmother had done to protect her legacy. He'd assumed that marriage automatically entitled him to half of any assets I might acquire, regardless of the source or circumstances of the acquisition. The most telling aspect of Derek's legal strategy was his complete focus on financial compensation, rather than any attempt to salvage our relationship. He wasn't fighting to win me back, he was fighting to extract maximum financial benefit from our failed marriage. His lawyer's filings painted me as a deceptive spouse who had hidden significant assets, rather than acknowledging that Derek had never shown enough interest in my family background to learn about the trust fund's existence. Derek's case is particularly weak because he never contributed to the conditions that led to your inheritance, Rebecca explained. Your grandmother's wealth came from her own business achievements decades before you met Derek. He has no more claim to those assets than a stranger would. The legal proceedings dragged on for several months, during which Derek's behavior became increasingly desperate and revealing. He contacted mutual friends to complain about my greed and vindictiveness, apparently not understanding that keeping an inheritance I'd legitimately received was neither greedy nor vindictive. His most pathetic attempt came when he tried to reconcile with me, claiming that his legal challenge had been motivated by hurt feelings rather than financial greed. Derek showed up at my New York apartment uninvited, carrying flowers and wearing the kind of remorseful expression he'd perfected during our marriage whenever his behavior had consequences he wanted to avoid. "Sarah, I've been thinking about everything that happened between us," Derek said when I reluctantly agreed to speak with him in my building's lobby. I realize I made mistakes during your diagnosis, and I want to make things right." The conversation that followed was illuminating. In its complete lack of genuine self-reflection, Derek apologized for being less supportive than I should have been during my cancer diagnosis, but he framed his neglect as misunderstanding rather than character failure. He admitted that he'd been surprised by my inheritance, but he seemed to believe that sharing the money would somehow repair the fundamental problems in our relationship. "I know I wasn't the husband you needed when you were sick," Derek continued, "but we could use this opportunity to build something better together. With your resources, we could travel, start a family, maybe even work together on business ventures. This could be a new beginning for us." Derek's vision of our potential future revealed everything about how he understood relationships and responsibility. In his mind, my money could solve problems that stemmed from his consistent failure to value me as an equal partner. He seemed to believe that financial resources could substitute for emotional intelligence, empathy, and genuine care. "Derek," I said finally, "money doesn't change the fact that you abandoned me at a pharmacy when I was picking up cancer medication. It doesn't change the years of feeling invisible in my own marriage. And it certainly doesn't change the fact that you're only interested in reconciliation now that you know I'm wealthy." Derek's response was predictably defensive. He claimed that his timing was coincidental, that he'd been doing self-reflection during our separation regardless of my financial circumstances. He insisted that his legal challenge to our divorce had been motivated by principle rather than greed, though he couldn't explain what principles were involved in claiming half of an inheritance he'd never known existed. "You're being unfair," Derek said when his reconciliation attempts failed to move me. "I'm trying to apologize and work things out, but you're holding grudges instead of focusing on our future together." The accusation that I was holding grudges rather than making rational decisions based on Derek's demonstrated character was perhaps the perfect summary of our entire relationship. In Derek's worldview, I was supposed to ignore his consistent pattern of selfishness and neglect because he was offering vague promises of future improvement motivated by access to my money. "I'm not holding grudges," I replied. "I'm making decisions based on what I've learned about your character and what I want for my future. And what I want doesn't include being married to someone who only values me when I have something he wants." Derek's final attempt to salvage our relationship was an ultimatum disguised as a romantic gesture. He informed me that he was willing to drop his legal challenges to the divorce if I would agree to provide him with a reasonable settlement that would allow him to maintain his lifestyle while we both moved forward positively. The offer revealed Derek's fundamental misunderstanding of power dynamics and negotiation. He seemed to believe that dropping legal challenges he couldn't win constituted a concession worthy of financial compensation. He was essentially asking me to pay him to stop harassing me with frivolous lawsuits. "Derek," I told him during what would be our final conversation, "you're not in a position to make demands or negotiate settlements. You have no legal claim to my inheritance, no leverage in our divorce, and no ability to prevent me from moving forward with my life exactly as I choose." Derek's reaction to this reality check was immediate anger followed by threats that revealed his true character more clearly than any previous interaction. He warned me that he would make things difficult if I didn't agree to his financial demands. He threatened to tell everyone about my inheritance, as if having money were somehow shameful. He even suggested that I would regret being so selfish when I needed support during my cancer treatment. The threats were empty but illuminating. Derek still believed that he held some kind of power over my circumstances or reputation that he could leverage to extract financial concessions. He couldn't understand that my inheritance had given me complete independence from his approval, support, or social connections. "Derek," I said with finality, "you have nothing I need and nothing I want. The divorce will proceed as planned, you'll receive nothing beyond what the law requires, and I'll never see you again after the paperwork is finalized." Derek's legal challenges were eventually dismissed with prejudice, meaning he couldn't refile them under any circumstances. The judge's ruling was particularly scathing about Derek's attempts to claim assets from a trust fund designed specifically to prevent such claims. Mr. Richardson's arguments demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of inheritance law and prenuptial agreements, the judge stated during the final hearing. His estranged wife's inheritance from her grandmother is not marital property under any reasonable interpretation of the law. The divorce was finalized in May, exactly 6 months after my 35th birthday and the trust fund activation. Derek received nothing beyond his personal belongings and half of the modest assets we'd accumulated during our marriage. I kept the trust fund, the investments, the properties, and most importantly, the freedom to build a life based on my own values and desires. By the time my cancer treatment was completed in June, I had achieved what Dr. Rodriguez called complete remission, with excellent long-term prognosis. The personalized therapy had eliminated all detectable cancer cells while preserving my overall health and energy levels. I felt stronger physically than I had in years, and emotionally, I felt reborn. The transformation from sick, financially dependent wife to healthy, independently wealthy woman had taken less than a year, but it felt like a complete lifetime change. Standing in my New York apartment, reviewing clean test results and divorce paperwork, I realized that Derek's abandonment at the pharmacy had been the catalyst for discovering who I really was when I had the resources to become fully myself. My treatment team at Memorial Sloan Kettering had introduced me to other patients who were using their own financial resources to access cutting-edge care. Many of them were entrepreneurs, investors, or executives who had built significant wealth through their own achievements. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who assumed competence and success rather than questioning or minimizing my capabilities. "You should consider joining our advisory board," Dr. Rodriguez suggested during my final treatment appointment. "Your experience with personalized cancer therapy could help us improve access for other patients who might benefit from these protocols." The invitation to contribute to cancer research and treatment development represented a completely new kind of opportunity. Instead of struggling to manage illness within limited financial resources, I could help expand access to better treatment for other patients facing similar challenges. Victoria had been encouraging me to consider how I wanted to use my inheritance beyond personal needs and lifestyle improvements. My grandmother's trust fund included strong recommendations for charitable giving and social impact investing, areas where my resources could create meaningful change beyond my own circumstances. Helena always believed that wealth came with responsibility to improve conditions for others, Victoria explained during one of our quarterly reviews. "She'd be proud to see you using your inheritance to expand cancer treatment access for patients who can't afford personalized protocols." The idea of funding research and treatment programs that could help other cancer patients appealed to me on both personal and practical levels. My own experience with the vast difference between standard and premium medical care had shown me how financial barriers prevented many patients from accessing potentially life-saving treatments. Working with Victoria and her team, I established the Whitmore Foundation for Cancer Research, focused specifically on making personalized therapy protocols available to patients regardless of their financial circumstances. The foundation's initial funding commitment was $50 million, with plans to expand based on research outcomes and treatment success rates. The foundation will partner with major cancer centers to subsidize personalized treatment for patients who meet medical criteria but lack financial resources, Victoria explained during our planning meetings. This approach allows us to maximize impact while maintaining the high-quality care standards that made your own treatment so successful. The foundation work provided a sense of purpose that had been missing during my marriage to Derek. Instead of managing household logistics and supporting someone else's career goals, I was using my resources to create opportunities that could genuinely improve and save lives. The contrast between my new life and my previous existence with Derek was so stark that it sometimes felt like comparing two different people rather than two phases of the same person's journey. The woman who had stood outside that Walgreens, holding cancer medication and watching her husband drive away, bore little resemblance to the woman who was now funding cancer research and building a life of meaningful impact. Derek had been wrong about everything. He'd thought I needed his financial support to survive, but I'd inherited more money than he could earn in multiple lifetimes. He thought I was too dependent to manage major life changes independently, but I'd successfully navigated cancer treatment, divorce proceedings, and wealth management without any assistance from him. Most importantly, he thought my needs and opinions were secondary to his comfort and convenience, but I discovered that my judgment and values were actually quite sound when I had the freedom to act on them. The final irony was that Derek's abandonment at the pharmacy had been intended to make me more grateful for his presence in my life. Instead, it had forced me to confront how little he actually contributed to my well-being and how much better my life could be without his consistent negativity and neglect. Standing in my apartment overlooking Central Park, reviewing foundation documents and cancer research proposals, I realized that Derek's cruelty had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible, the clarity to see that I deserved better, and the resources to create it. 2 years after my cancer treatment ended, I received an invitation that would change my understanding of success and vindication forever. The American Cancer Society wanted to honor me with their Distinguished Philanthropist Award for the Whitmore Foundation's groundbreaking work in making personalized cancer therapy accessible to underserved patients. The ceremony would be held at the Marriott Marquis in Chicago, the city where my transformation had begun outside a Walgreens pharmacy on a cold December night. The irony of returning to Chicago as an honored guest rather than a struggling cancer patient wasn't lost on me. In the 2 years since my divorce from Derek, I had built something that extended far beyond personal wealth or comfort. The Whitmore Foundation had funded treatment for over 3,000 patients who couldn't afford personalized cancer therapy, with a 93% success rate that was revolutionizing how the medical community approached cancer care for low-income populations. "Sarah, your foundation's impact has been extraordinary," said Dr. Margaret Foster, the Cancer Society's president, during our pre-ceremony meeting. "We've never seen philanthropic funding create such measurable improvements in patient outcomes. You've essentially created a new model for how medical philanthropy can directly translate into lives saved." The foundation's success had attracted attention from major medical institutions worldwide. Harvard Medical School had invited me to speak about philanthropy and healthcare access. The World Health Organization had consulted with me about implementing similar programs internationally. Forbes had featured me on their cover as one of the most influential philanthropists under 40, with a headline that read, "The heiress who's changing cancer treatment forever." But the recognition that meant the most came from the patients themselves. Letters arrived daily from people whose lives had been saved by treatments funded through the foundation. Mothers who could watch their children graduate from college. Artists who could continue creating. Teachers who could return to their classrooms. Each letter reminded me that wealth's true power lay not in what it could buy for yourself, but in what it could create for others. The Chicago ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday evening in November, exactly 2 years after Derek had abandoned me at that pharmacy. Victoria had arranged for me to stay at the Ritz-Carlton and arrive by private car, eliminating any possibility of awkward encounters before the formal event. But as fate would have it, the universe had different plans for how my return to Chicago would unfold. The morning of the ceremony, I decided to visit the Walgreens where my transformation had begun. It wasn't nostalgia that drew me there, but a desire to acknowledge how far I'd traveled from that moment of apparent helplessness to this moment of genuine empowerment. I wanted to see the place where Derek's cruelty had inadvertently set me free, not as a victim returning to the scene of her trauma, but as someone who had transformed that trauma into purpose. The pharmacy looked exactly the same as it had 2 years earlier. The same fluorescent lighting, the same layout, even the same promotional displays advertising winter medications and holiday health supplies. But everything about my relationship to that space had changed. Instead of clutching cancer medication while watching my husband drive away, I was returning as someone who had helped thousands of other cancer patients access better treatment than I had initially thought possible. Standing in the parking lot where Derek had left me, I felt a profound sense of completion rather than pain. That moment of abandonment had been the catalyst for discovering not just my inheritance, but my capacity for independence, leadership, and meaningful impact. Derek had intended to diminish me, but instead he had forced me to discover strengths I might never have developed if I had remained comfortable in our mediocre marriage. My moment of reflection was interrupted by a voice I recognized immediately, though it sounded different than I remembered. More strained, less confident, lacking the casual arrogance that had characterized Derek's speech throughout our marriage. "Sarah? Is that really you?" I turned to see Derek walking out of the pharmacy, carrying a prescription bag and looking significantly older than the 2 years since our divorce should have warranted. His hair was graying at the temples, his face showed stress lines that hadn't been there during our marriage, and his clothes, while still neat, lacked the expensive casual elegance he had always maintained. The encounter I had never planned but perhaps always known would happen eventually was unfolding in the exact location where Derek had demonstrated his true character most clearly. The symbolism was perfect in a way that no planned confrontation could have been. "Hello, Derek," I replied calmly, studying his face for signs of the man who had once held such power over my emotions and self-perception. What I saw was someone who looked diminished rather than threatening, worn down by circumstances rather than strengthened by them. Derek's expression cycled through several emotions as he processed seeing me in person for the first time since our divorce proceedings. Surprise at the unexpected encounter. Recognition of how much I had changed, from my obvious confidence to my expensive but understated clothing to the simple fact that I was returning to Chicago as a visitor rather than a resident. And something that looked like regret, though I suspected it was more about his circumstances than genuine remorse for his behavior. "You look incredible," Derek said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and something darker that might have been resentment. "I heard about the foundation, the awards, all the recognition you've been getting. It's amazing what you've accomplished." The words were complimentary, but Derek's tone suggested he found my success more troubling than inspiring. During our marriage, he had consistently minimized my achievements and potential. Seeing concrete evidence that I had been capable of extraordinary things when freed from his influence seemed to challenge his entire understanding of our relationship dynamics. "Thank you," I replied simply, neither encouraging further conversation, nor shutting it down entirely. I was curious to see what Derek wanted from this encounter and what it might reveal about how his life had progressed since our divorce. "I'm picking up medication for my mother," Derek continued, apparently feeling the need to explain his presence at the pharmacy. "She's been having health issues, and I've been helping her manage her medical appointments and prescriptions." The information was mundane, but it suggested that Derek's life had become focused on caretaking responsibilities rather than the career advancement and social climbing that had occupied most of his energy during our marriage. I wondered if his mother's health problems had given him any insight into how inadequately he had supported me during my cancer diagnosis. "I'm sorry to hear about your mother's health," I said genuinely. Whatever Derek's failures as a husband, I had no interest in being cruel about his family's medical challenges. Derek seemed surprised by my sincere response, as if he had expected me to be vindictive or dismissive about his current difficulties. His next words suggested he had been thinking about our marriage and divorce more than I might have expected. "Sarah, I've been doing a lot of thinking about what happened between us," Derek said, his voice carrying a vulnerability I had never heard during our marriage. "I know I wasn't a good husband to you, especially when you were dealing with cancer. I realize now that I was selfish and unsupportive in ways that probably made everything harder for you." The admission was more honest than anything Derek had said during our divorce proceedings, when he had focused on legal challenges and financial claims rather than acknowledging any responsibility for our marriage's failure. But it was also carefully worded to minimize his culpability while presenting himself as someone who had grown and learned from his mistakes. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied, though I wasn't sure Derek's self-reflection was as deep or genuine as he wanted to portray. That period was difficult, but it taught me important things about what I need from relationships and what I'm capable of handling independently. Derek's response revealed that his regret was more about lost opportunities than genuine remorse for causing me pain. "I can't help wondering what might have happened if I had been more supportive," Derek said. "If I had been a better partner during your treatment, maybe we could have built something together with your inheritance. We could have been a team working on the foundation, traveling, making a real impact together." The fantasy Derek was describing demonstrated that he still fundamentally misunderstood both my motivations and the reasons our marriage had failed. He seemed to believe that better behavior on his part would have entitled him to share in my success, rather than recognizing that his consistent selfishness had been incompatible with any kind of genuine partnership. "Derek," I said carefully, "our marriage didn't fail because you weren't supportive enough during my cancer treatment. It failed because we were never truly partners. The cancer diagnosis just made that reality impossible to ignore anymore." Derek's expression suggested he was struggling to process this distinction. In his mind, marriage problems were tactical issues that could be solved with better behavior rather than fundamental incompatibilities that made long-term partnership impossible. "But we were together for 8 years, Derek protested. "We built a life together, shared experiences, supported each other through different challenges. That has to count for something." Derek's version of our marriage history was so different from my experience that it felt like he was describing a relationship I had never participated in. His claim that we had supported each other during various challenges was particularly jarring, given his consistent pattern of expecting support while providing minimal reciprocation. "We shared a living space and financial expenses for 8 years, I corrected gently. "But I'm not sure we ever truly supported each other as equal partners. Most of the support in our relationship flowed in one direction." Derek's defensive response revealed that he still couldn't acknowledge the fundamental imbalance that had characterized our marriage. "That's not fair, Sarah. I worked hard to provide financial stability for us. I included you in my social circle, helped you feel connected to a community. I may not have been perfect, but I was committed to our relationship." Derek's definition of commitment apparently included working for his own financial benefit, socializing with people he enjoyed, and remaining legally married while providing minimal emotional support. He seemed to believe that avoiding divorce constituted commitment regardless of the quality of partnership he offered. "Derek," I said finally, "commitment means being willing to prioritize your partner's well-being even when it's inconvenient for you. It means showing up emotionally, not just physically. It means treating your spouse as an equal whose needs matter as much as your own." Derek's silence suggested he was beginning to understand the gap between his perception of himself as a committed husband and the reality of how he had actually behaved throughout our marriage. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a woman I didn't recognize, who approached Derek with the familiarity of someone who knew him well. She was attractive in a conventional way, with carefully styled blonde hair and clothing that suggested middle-class professional success. More interestingly, she moved toward Derek with the confidence of someone who expected to be included in his conversations rather than waiting to be introduced. "Derek, I finished getting the groceries for your mom," the woman said, before noticing me and pausing with curiosity rather than suspicion. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were talking to someone." Derek's obvious discomfort with the situation suggested that he hadn't mentioned me to his new girlfriend, or at least hadn't prepared her for the possibility of an encounter. His introduction was awkward in a way that revealed more about his current relationship dynamics than he probably intended. "Jennifer, this is Sarah, my ex-wife," Derek said quickly. "Sarah, this is Jennifer. We've been dating for about 6 months." Jennifer's expression shifted immediately upon learning my identity. Not with hostility, but with the kind of intense curiosity that suggested she had heard stories about me that didn't match the person she was actually meeting. "It's nice to meet you, Sarah," Jennifer said politely. "Derek has mentioned you." "Of course. I heard about your foundation work. It sounds incredible what you're doing for cancer patients." Jennifer's tone was genuinely admiring rather than competitive, which suggested she was more secure in her relationship with Derek than I had been during most of our marriage. But it also suggested that Derek had shared information about my success in ways that probably didn't reflect favorably on his own choices during our marriage. "Thank you," I replied. "The foundation has been incredibly rewarding work. It's amazing what becomes possible when you can remove financial barriers from medical treatment." Derek's expression during this exchange revealed his discomfort with Jennifer learning more about my current circumstances. During our marriage, he had consistently minimized my achievements and potential. Having his current girlfriend express admiration for my success probably challenged the narrative he had constructed about our relationship's failure. "Sarah was just telling me about some of the foundation's recent projects," Derek said, though I had actually said nothing about specific foundation work. "She's being honored by the Cancer Society tonight for her philanthropic achievements." Derek's decision to share information about the ceremony suggested he was trying to demonstrate to Jennifer that he was comfortable with my success and supportive of my current endeavors. But his forced enthusiasm felt performative rather than genuine. "That's wonderful," Jennifer responded. "You must be so proud of what you've built. Derek mentioned that you started the foundation after your own cancer treatment. It takes incredible strength to turn a personal challenge into something that helps so many other people." Jennifer's comment revealed that Derek had shared details about my medical history with her, though probably not the full context of how unsupportive he had been during my treatment. Her admiration for my resilience was sincere, but it was based on incomplete information about Derek's role during that period. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Derek was now dating someone who respected and admired qualities in me that he had consistently failed to recognize or value during our marriage. Jennifer's genuine appreciation for my strength and achievements highlighted how differently Derek might have experienced our relationship if he had been capable of seeing me as clearly as his new girlfriend could see me within minutes of meeting. "The foundation grew out of my experience with the healthcare system during treatment," I explained to Jennifer. "I realized how much difference financial resources could make in accessing better care, and I wanted to extend those opportunities to patients who couldn't afford them independently." Derek's visible discomfort with the conversation suggested he was remembering his own behavior during my treatment and recognizing how it would sound to Jennifer if she learned the full story. His attempts to redirect the conversation were transparent in their desperation. "Sarah's always been very driven about her causes," Derek said, as if my commitment to helping cancer patients was a personality quirk rather than a response to meaningful experiences. "She's incredibly focused when she sets her mind to something." Derek's characterization of my foundation work as causes rather than life-saving medical philanthropy revealed that he still didn't fully understand or respect what I had accomplished. Even when trying to be complimentary, he couldn't acknowledge the significance of work that had directly saved thousands of lives. Jennifer's response showed that she understood the distinction Derek was missing. "It's not just drive, though," Jennifer said thoughtfully. "It takes real compassion and vision to see how your own experience can become something that helps other people. Most people who go through cancer treatment just focus on their own recovery." Jennifer's insight was more perceptive than anything Derek had ever said about my motivations or character. In the few minutes since meeting me, she had demonstrated a better understanding of my values and capabilities than Derek had shown during 8 years of marriage. The contrast between Jennifer's immediate respect for my achievements and Derek's historical pattern of minimizing them was striking. It suggested that Derek's inability to value me appropriately hadn't been about my actual worth or potential, but about his own insecurities and need to maintain a sense of superiority in our relationship. "I should probably get going," I said, recognizing that the encounter had served its purpose in showing me how much Derek had misunderstood about my character and potential. "I have some preparation to do for tonight's ceremony." Derek's response revealed that he was still processing the reality of my transformation and success. "Sarah, before you go," Derek said hesitantly, "I want you to know that I'm genuinely happy for everything you've accomplished. I know our marriage didn't work out, but seeing what you've built since then makes me realize that you were always capable of extraordinary things. I'm sorry I wasn't able to see that or support it when we were together." Derek's apology was more honest and comprehensive than anything he had said during our divorce proceedings. But it was also hollow in its timing and motivation. Derek wasn't apologizing because he had gained genuine insight into his behavior, but because he was confronted with irrefutable evidence of my success that challenged his previous assessment of my capabilities. "I appreciate that, Derek," I replied sincerely. "I hope things go well for you and your mother's health improves." Derek's final words as I walked away revealed everything about how our encounter had affected him. "Sarah, would it be possible for us to stay in touch? Not romantically," he added quickly, glancing at Jennifer, "but as friends? I'd love to hear about the Foundation's work and maybe even find ways to support what you're doing." Derek's request to maintain contact wasn't motivated by genuine friendship or altruistic interest in cancer research. He was asking for access to my success and recognition, hoping to associate himself with achievements he had never supported and had actively discouraged during our marriage. "I think it's better if we maintain the boundaries we established during our divorce," I replied gently but firmly. "But I wish you both well." Walking away from Derek and Jennifer, I felt a profound sense of closure that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. Derek had revealed himself exactly as I remembered him, someone who could recognize value and achievement only after it had been proven beyond question, someone who wanted to associate himself with success he had never supported, someone who still fundamentally misunderstood the difference between genuine partnership and convenient arrangement. The encounter had confirmed what I had suspected but never had the opportunity to verify. Derek's failure to value me during our marriage hadn't been about my actual worth or potential. It had been about his own limitations and insecurities. Given the freedom and resources to discover my authentic capabilities, I had exceeded even my own expectations for what I could accomplish. That evening, the American Cancer Society ceremony unfolded with the kind of elegant formality that I was still learning to navigate as someone who had inherited significant wealth rather than earning it through business achievements. The ballroom at the Marriott Marquis was filled with medical professionals, philanthropists, and cancer survivors whose stories reminded me why the Foundation's work mattered beyond personal satisfaction or public recognition. Dr. Foster's introduction of my award was comprehensive and moving, detailing not just the Foundation's statistical achievements but the individual lives that had been saved through access to personalized cancer treatment. "The Whitmore Foundation has fundamentally changed how we think about healthcare equity," Dr. Foster explained to the audience of several hundred attendees. "By making cutting-edge cancer treatment available regardless of financial circumstances, Sarah Whitmore has proven that philanthropy can directly translate into lives saved and families preserved." Standing at the podium to accept the award, I looked out at an audience that included some of the most respected medical professionals in the country. Many of them had initially been skeptical about whether a young heiress could effectively deploy inherited wealth to create meaningful medical impact. The Foundation's success had proven that financial resources, properly applied with expert guidance and genuine commitment, could indeed revolutionize healthcare access. 2 years ago, I was a cancer patient struggling to understand my treatment options while managing the financial stress that often accompanies serious illness. I began my acceptance speech. I was fortunate enough to inherit resources that allowed me to access the best possible care, and that experience taught me how much difference financial barriers make in determining patient outcomes. I spoke about the Foundation's work without mentioning Derek or the personal circumstances that had led to my inheritance becoming available at the exact moment I needed it most. The audience didn't need to know that my transformation from struggling cancer patient to influential philanthropist had been catalyzed by a husband who abandoned me outside a pharmacy. What mattered was the work itself and the lives it had saved. The Foundation's success belongs to the medical professionals who believed that healthcare equity was worth pursuing, the patients who trusted us with their treatment, and the researchers who proved that personalized medicine could be scaled to serve populations previously excluded from cutting-edge care. I continued. What we've learned is that the technology exists to save more lives. What we needed to change was the financial structure that prevented people from accessing it. The speech concluded with recognition for the teams at Memorial Sloan Kettering and other partner institutions who had made the foundation's work possible. The standing ovation that followed felt like validation not just for my individual efforts, but for the entire approach of using inherited wealth to create systemic change, rather than just personal comfort. After the ceremony, dozens of medical professionals and fellow philanthropists approached me with ideas for expanding the foundation's work. Oncologists described promising research that needed funding. Other cancer survivors shared stories about friends and family members who could benefit from foundation programs. Wealthy individuals expressed interest in supporting or replicating our model in other disease areas. "Sarah, your work has inspired a new generation of medical philanthropists," said Dr. James Morrison, the head of oncology at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. "We're seeing more young wealthy individuals who want to fund direct patient care rather than just research or facility construction. The Whitmore Foundation model is becoming the gold standard for how inherited wealth can create immediate medical impact." The recognition felt significant not because it validated my personal worth, but because it confirmed that the foundation was creating sustainable change that would outlast my individual involvement. The model we had developed could be replicated by other philanthropists, expanded to other diseases, and scaled to serve larger populations of patients who needed access to expensive treatments. Later that evening, alone in my hotel suite overlooking Chicago's skyline, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from that Walgreens parking lot to this moment of recognition and impact. Derek's abandonment had been the catalyst, but the transformation had required much more than just access to money. It had required the courage to leave a relationship that diminished me, the wisdom to use inherited wealth responsibly, and the commitment to turn personal privilege into meaningful service. The irony of Derek's timing in abandoning me continued to amaze me. If he had waited one more day, I would have gained access to my inheritance while still married to him, potentially complicating the divorce and my ability to use the money independently. If he had been more supportive during my cancer treatment, I might have felt obligated to share the inheritance with him despite our marriage's fundamental problems. His cruelty had inadvertently given me the clarity and freedom to discover who I could become when I had unlimited resources and no one trying to diminish my potential. Standing at the window of my hotel suite, looking down at the city where my real life had begun outside a pharmacy 2 years earlier, I realized that Derek had been right about one thing. That night had taught me about independence. Just not in the way he had intended. Derek had meant to teach me that I was dependent on his support and goodwill, that I needed his presence in my life more than he needed mine. Instead, he had taught me that I was capable of extraordinary things when I had the freedom and resources to act on my own judgment and values. The woman who had stood in that parking lot holding cancer medication and watching her husband drive away had been a victim of circumstances beyond her control. The woman who now stood in a luxury hotel suite after being honored for saving thousands of lives was the creator of her own destiny, someone who had transformed inherited privilege into meaningful purpose. Derek's abandonment had been intended as punishment, but it had become the foundation of my freedom. His cruelty had been meant to diminish me, but it had instead revealed strength I might never have discovered if I had remained comfortable in our mediocre marriage. Looking back at the city lights of Chicago, I felt nothing but gratitude for the moment when Derek drove away and left me to discover who I really was when no one was trying to convince me I was less than I actually could be. That moment of apparent abandonment had actually been the beginning of everything worth having in my life. Tomorrow I would return to New York and continue building the Foundation's programs, expanding access to personalized cancer treatment, and using my inheritance to create opportunities for healing that went far beyond what money could buy for myself alone. The work would continue not because I needed to prove anything to Derek or anyone else, but because I had discovered that using privilege to serve others created a satisfaction that no amount of personal luxury could match. Derek had given me the perfect gift without ever intending to, the clarity to see that I deserved better than what I had been accepting, and the opportunity to create it for myself and thousands of other people who needed someone to believe their lives were worth saving regardless of their ability to pay for the treatments that could save them. 5 years had passed since Derek abandoned me at that pharmacy, and I found myself standing in the most unexpected place of all, the boardroom of Richardson Construction, Derek's family business that had been struggling for years. The irony wasn't lost on me that the company bearing his name was now seeking financial assistance from the woman he had once dismissed as incapable of managing her own life. The meeting had been arranged through intermediaries after Richardson Construction filed for bankruptcy protection. Their largest creditor, Chicago Commercial Bank, happened to be an institution where the Whitmore Foundation maintained significant investments. When the bank's president, Michael Stevens, approached me about potentially acquiring the construction company's assets, I had initially declined without much consideration. "Sarah, I understand your reluctance given your personal history with Derek Richardson, Michael had explained during our preliminary conversation. But Richardson Construction owns several properties that could be perfect locations for the medical facilities you've been wanting to establish. The company has good bones, it's just been poorly managed financially. The Whitmore Foundation had indeed been seeking locations for regional cancer treatment centers that could provide personalized therapy closer to patients' homes rather than requiring them to travel to major metropolitan hospitals. Richardson Construction owns 6 properties across the Midwest that could be converted into state-of-the-art medical facilities, creating a network of accessible cancer care that would serve thousands of patients who couldn't afford travel and accommodation costs. Victoria had been enthusiastic about the potential acquisition when I discussed it with her during our quarterly strategy meeting. Helena would have appreciated this particular irony, Victoria said with a smile that carried decades of understanding my grandmother's sense of justice. Using Derek's failed business to expand cancer treatment access would be exactly the kind of poetic justice she believed the universe sometimes provided. The decision to proceed with acquisition negotiations hadn't been motivated by revenge or desire to humiliate Derek. By this point in my life, Derek had become so irrelevant to my daily existence that I rarely thought about him except when reminded by external circumstances. The acquisition was purely strategic, a business decision that would advance the Foundation's mission while providing excellent value for our investment dollars. The Whitmore Foundation had grown exponentially in the 5 years since its establishment. What had begun as a $50 million commitment to subsidizing personalized cancer treatment had evolved into a comprehensive healthcare initiative. With over $2 billion in assets and programs spanning 3 continents. We now operated 12 treatment centers, funded research at 47 universities, and provided direct financial assistance to over 15,000 cancer patients annually. My role had evolved accordingly. No longer just a philanthropist distributing inherited wealth, I had become a healthcare industry leader whose opinions influenced policy discussions at the highest levels of government and medicine. The World Health Organization had appointed me to their Global Health Equity Council. Harvard Medical School had offered me a visiting professorship. The president had consulted with me about healthcare reform initiatives. The transformation from abandoned wife to international healthcare advocate had required developing skills and expertise that Derek would never have believed I possessed. I now understood complex medical research, international healthcare economics, pharmaceutical development timelines, and regulatory approval processes. The Foundation's success wasn't just about having money to spend, it was about knowing how to spend it effectively to create sustainable systemic change. Walking into Richardson Construction's conference room for the acquisition meeting felt like entering a museum of my former life. The building itself was tired and dated, reflecting the company's financial struggles. The conference table was the same cheap veneer Derek had always claimed was perfectly adequate for business meetings. Even the coffee service was identical to what I remembered from the few occasions when Derek had brought me to company events. Derek was already seated at the table when I arrived, flanked by his lawyer and accountant. He looked significantly older than the 2 years since our encounter at the pharmacy, worn down by the stress of financial failure and impending business collapse. His clothes were clean but showed signs of wear that suggested he was cutting expenses wherever possible. Also present was Jennifer, Derek's girlfriend whom I had met briefly outside the Walgreens. She had apparently become more involved in Derek's business affairs, serving as his administrative assistant and bookkeeper. Her presence suggested their relationship had deepened into practical partnership, though whether motivated by love or financial necessity was unclear. The most surprising attendee was Derek's mother, Patricia Richardson, whom I hadn't seen since our divorce proceedings. She looked frail and tired, probably reflecting the health issues Derek had mentioned during our previous encounter. Her presence at a business meeting suggested the family viewed this acquisition as their last hope for salvaging something from Derek's professional failures. "Sarah," Derek said as I took my seat across from him, "I want to thank you for considering this opportunity. I know our personal history makes this situation unusual, but I hope we can approach it as a business transaction that benefits everyone involved." Derek's tone was carefully professional, stripped of the casual arrogance that had characterized his speech during our marriage. He was clearly trying to present himself as a competent business partner rather than a failed husband seeking charity from his wealthy ex-wife. "I'm here because the Foundation is interested in your properties for medical facility development," I replied evenly. "This is purely a business evaluation based on strategic fit and financial value." Derek's lawyer, Robert Chen, began the formal presentation of Richardson Construction's assets and liabilities. The company owned 6 properties across Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin, all in good condition but burdened by mortgages and liens that exceeded their current market value. The business itself had consistent revenue but margins too thin to service its debt obligations. The properties would require significant renovation to meet medical facility standards, Robert explained, but their locations are ideal for regional healthcare services. Each building has parking capacity and accessibility, features that would support patient care operations. As Robert detailed the financial structure of Richardson Construction's debts and assets, I found myself studying Derek's reactions to his company's situation being dissected for potential acquisition. He listened with the resigned attention of someone watching an autopsy performed on something he had once cared about but knew was beyond saving. The numbers confirmed what Michael Stevens had suggested. Richardson Construction had good underlying assets but had been managed with the kind of short-term thinking and financial recklessness that eventually destroys even well-positioned businesses. Derek had consistently borrowed against future revenue to fund current expenses, creating a debt spiral that became unsustainable when construction projects were delayed or cancelled. "Mr. Richardson," I said when Robert finished his presentation, "can you explain the decision-making process that led to the company's current financial position?" Derek's response revealed that his approach to business had been as poorly conceived as his approach to marriage. "The construction industry is cyclical," Derek said defensively. "We had some projects delayed due to permit issues and weather problems. I borrowed against future contracts to maintain operations, expecting the market to improve more quickly than it did." Derek's explanation demonstrated the same lack of strategic thinking and personal accountability that had characterized his behavior throughout our marriage. He attributed business failure to external factors beyond his control rather than acknowledging planning mistakes and management decisions that had created unnecessary risk. "Did you consider more conservative financing approaches that would have provided stability during market downturns?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Derek's defensive response confirmed my assessment. "Conservative approaches don't generate the kind of growth we needed to compete with larger construction companies," Derek replied. "Sometimes you have to take calculated risks to build something significant." The irony of Derek lecturing me about calculated risks wasn't lost on anyone in the room. His calculated risks had destroyed a business that should have been profitable, while my calculated risks had built a foundation that was transforming healthcare access across multiple countries. Jennifer spoke for the first time during the meeting, and her comments revealed more insight into Richardson Construction's problems than Derek's explanations had provided. "The company's financial management has improved significantly over the past year," Jennifer said diplomatically. "We've implemented better accounting systems and cash flow planning that should prevent similar problems in the future." Jennifer's careful wording suggested that Derek had been excluded from financial decision-making and that she had been attempting to repair damage from years of poor management. Her involvement probably represented Richardson Construction's best chance for future viability, though the existing debt burden made recovery difficult regardless of improved operations. Patricia Richardson had remained silent throughout the business discussions, but her expression suggested she was processing the reality of her son's professional failure. During our marriage, she had consistently praised Derek's business acumen and criticized my career focus. Watching her son's company being evaluated for acquisition by the daughter-in-law she had dismissed must have been particularly difficult. "Sarah," Patricia said finally, "I want to acknowledge that Derek made serious mistakes in how he handled your marriage and his business. I know I wasn't always fair to you either, and I regret that. I hope you can consider this acquisition based on its merits rather than our family's past behavior." Patricia's apology was more honest and comprehensive than anything Derek had ever offered. It suggested that financial crisis had forced the Richardson family to confront realities about Derek's character and capabilities that they had previously avoided acknowledging. "Mrs. Richardson," I replied gently, "this decision will be based entirely on whether acquiring these properties serves the Foundation's mission to expand cancer treatment access. Personal history isn't relevant to strategic planning." My response was true but also diplomatic. While personal history wouldn't determine my decision, it certainly added emotional complexity to evaluating a transaction that would essentially transfer Derek's life work to the ex-wife he had consistently underestimated. The Foundation's real estate team had already conducted thorough evaluations of Richardson Construction's properties. Their report confirmed that 5 of the 6 buildings could be converted into medical facilities at reasonable cost, while the 6th property could be sold to offset acquisition expenses. The total investment required would be approximately $30 million, representing less than 2% of the Foundation's current assets. "The Whitmore Foundation is prepared to acquire Richardson Construction's assets," I announced after reviewing the final financial projections. "We'll assume all outstanding debts and provide fair market compensation for the properties." The acquisition will allow us to establish regional cancer treatment centers while preserving the jobs of Richardson Construction's current employees. Derek's reaction to my announcement was complex and revealing. Relief that his company's debts would be resolved, and his employees protected. Humiliation that his business failure had required rescue by the ex-wife he had abandoned. And something that looked like genuine gratitude, though it was probably motivated more by financial desperation than emotional growth. "Sarah, I can't thank you enough for this opportunity," Derek said, his voice carrying a vulnerability I had never heard during our marriage. "I know I don't deserve your consideration given how I treated you, but I'm grateful that you're willing to help preserve what my father built." Derek's reference to his father revealed an important aspect of the company's meaning that transcended his own professional failures. Richardson Construction had been founded by Derek's father 40 years earlier, representing a family legacy that Derek had squandered through poor decision-making and financial recklessness. "The foundation's interest is in the property's potential for medical use," I clarified. "But I'm glad the acquisition will preserve the company's employment and honor your father's legacy." The legal process of acquisition took 3 months to complete, during which I had minimal direct contact with Derek or his family. Victoria's team handled all negotiations and documentation, treating the transaction as a routine business acquisition, rather than a personal reconciliation between former spouses. The most satisfying aspect of the acquisition wasn't Derek's humiliation or the poetic justice of his failed business becoming part of my success. It was the opportunity to transform buildings where Derek had struggled to manage basic construction projects into facilities that would save thousands of lives through accessible cancer treatment. The first Richardson Construction property to be converted became the Whitmore Regional Cancer Center in Rockford, Illinois. The facility specialized in personalized therapy protocols for patients in rural areas who couldn't travel to major metropolitan hospitals. Within 6 months of opening, the center was treating over 200 patients monthly, with success rates that matched the most prestigious urban cancer facilities. Dr. Amanda Foster, the center's director, had previously worked at Memorial Sloan Kettering but had accepted the Rockford position because she believed in the foundation's mission to expand treatment access. The Rockford Center proves that excellent cancer care doesn't require patients to relocate to major cities, Dr. Foster explained during the facility's dedication ceremony. By bringing personalized therapy to regional locations, we're eliminating the financial and emotional barriers that prevent many patients from accessing optimal treatment. Standing in the renovated building where Derek had once conducted failing construction meetings, watching cancer patients receive life-saving treatment in beautifully designed medical suites, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal vindication. The transformation represented everything the Whitmore Foundation had been created to achieve, using inherited wealth to create sustainable improvements in healthcare access for people who needed it most. Derek attended the dedication ceremony, along with Jennifer and several former Richardson Construction employees who had been retained to manage building maintenance and operations. His presence felt appropriate rather than awkward. He was witnessing his family's business legacy being transformed into something far more meaningful than he had ever accomplished independently. "Sarah," Derek said during the reception following the dedication ceremony, "seeing what you've created here makes me realize how much potential I wasted during our marriage and afterward. You've built something that will outlast all of us and help thousands of people I'll never meet." Derek's observation was accurate but also irrelevant to my current life and priorities. His recognition of my achievements felt hollow because it was motivated by irrefutable evidence of success rather than genuine insight into my character and capabilities. "The Foundation's work isn't about individual achievement," I replied diplomatically. "It's about creating systems that improve healthcare access regardless of who gets credit for building them." Derek's response revealed that he still struggled to understand my motivations and values. "But you've become one of the most influential people in healthcare policy," Derek persisted. "Presidents call you for advice, medical schools compete for your attention, international organizations seek your guidance. You've built something extraordinary from what started as a personal health crisis." Derek seemed to believe that public recognition and political influence were my primary motivations for foundation work. He couldn't understand that the satisfaction came from the work itself rather than the recognition it generated. "Derek," I said finally, "the Foundation's success isn't about my personal achievement. It's about creating opportunities for healing that didn't exist before. The recognition is just a byproduct of work that matters for its own sake." Derek's inability to understand intrinsic motivation versus external validation was probably the clearest illustration of why our marriage had been doomed from the beginning. He evaluated success based on what others thought and said, while I had learned to measure value based on actual impact and personal fulfillment. Later that evening, alone in my hotel suite after the dedication ceremony, I reflected on the complete transformation my life had undergone since Derek abandoned me outside that pharmacy 5 years earlier. The scared, financially dependent woman, clutching cancer medication, had evolved into someone who controlled resources that could influence international health policy and save thousands of lives annually. But the most profound change wasn't external success or public recognition. It was the internal transformation from someone who accepted diminishment as normal to someone who understood her own worth and refused to compromise it for anyone's comfort or convenience. Derek's abandonment had been intended as punishment for not being sufficiently grateful for his presence in my life. Instead, it had become the catalyst for discovering who I could become when I had the freedom and resources to act on my own judgment and values. The Whitmore Foundation now operated in 17 countries, funded research at over 60 universities, and provided direct treatment assistance to more than 30,000 cancer patients annually. The work had expanded beyond cancer care to include other medical conditions where financial barriers prevented access to optimal treatment. My personal life had also evolved in ways Derek would never have imagined possible. I had developed friendships with world leaders, medical researchers, and fellow philanthropists who respected my judgment and sought my collaboration on complex global health initiatives. The social isolation I had experienced during my marriage had been replaced by meaningful relationships based on shared values and mutual respect. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my own instincts and judgment rather than seeking external validation for my decisions. The woman Derek had tried to convince was too emotional and impractical for serious responsibilities was now making strategic choices that influenced healthcare policy at the highest levels of government and international organizations. Standing at the window of my hotel room, looking out at the lights of Rockford where the first converted Richardson construction building was now saving lives around the clock, I realized that Derek had given me the greatest gift possible without ever intending to do so. His abandonment had forced me to discover strength I might never have developed if I had remained comfortable in our mediocre marriage. His cruelty had revealed the difference between genuine partnership and convenient arrangement. His inability to value me had taught me to value myself. The inheritance from my grandmother had provided the financial resources for transformation, but Derek's behavior had provided the emotional clarity to use those resources wisely. Without his abandonment forcing me to confront the reality of our relationship, I might have remained trapped in the illusion that settling for less than I deserved was acceptable or necessary. 6 months after the Rockford Center opened, I received an unexpected letter from Derek. Not a request for money or assistance, but a simple acknowledgement of what our encounter outside the pharmacy had ultimately created. Sarah, the letter began, I've been thinking about the night I left you at the pharmacy and how differently things might have unfolded if I had made better choices. I realize now that my behavior that night wasn't just cruel, it was the biggest mistake of my life. Not because of the money you inherited, but because I lost the opportunity to be part of something meaningful with someone who was always more capable and compassionate than I gave her credit for. Derek's letter continued with reflections on the Foundation's work and acknowledgement that my success had been built on qualities he had never recognized or valued during our marriage. Watching you transform Richardson Construction's buildings into cancer treatment centers has made me understand what I was too selfish and insecure to see when we were married, Derek wrote. You were never the problem in our relationship. I was. You deserved a partner who celebrated your achievements rather than feeling threatened by them. Derek's letter concluded with an apology that felt more genuine than any of his previous attempts at reconciliation. I'm not asking for forgiveness or friendship, Derek wrote. I'm just acknowledging that you became exactly who you were always meant to be, and I'm sorry I was too limited in my thinking to support that transformation when we were together. The work you're doing will outlast all of us and help thousands of people I'll never meet. That's a legacy worth building. Reading Derek's letter, I felt no satisfaction or vindication. His recognition of my worth felt irrelevant to my current life and priorities. But his acknowledgement that our marriage had failed because of his limitations rather than mine provided a kind of closure I hadn't realized I needed. Derek had been wrong about everything. My capabilities, my potential, my worth as a partner and as a person. But his wrongness had become my freedom, his cruelty had become my catalyst, and his abandonment had become the foundation of everything meaningful I had built since. The woman who stood outside that Walgreens 5 years ago had been a victim of circumstances beyond her control. The woman who now controlled billions of dollars in healthcare resources and influenced policy at the highest levels of international medicine was the creator of her own destiny. Derek's abandonment had been intended to teach me about dependence and gratitude. Instead, it had taught me about independence and self-worth. He had tried to diminish me but had instead freed me to discover exactly what I was capable of when Nobody was actively working to convince me I was less than I actually could be. Standing in my apartment overlooking Central Park, surrounded by foundation reports detailing thousands of lives saved and improved through accessible cancer treatment, I realized that Derek had been right about one thing. That night outside the pharmacy had been educational. It had taught me that I deserved better than what I had been accepting, and that I had the strength to create it for myself and thousands of other people who needed someone to believe their lives were worth saving regardless of their ability to pay for the treatments that could save them. Derek's cruelty had inadvertently given me everything I needed to become who I was meant to be. And for that, despite everything, I was grateful. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.